Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a prototype of this new upcoming device called the AOKZOE A1. Now before we get into it, let's do a quick story time. You see, in 2014, when the first Destiny game first came out, I was a huge fan. I've always loved the Bungie games, but this one was special to me. I love the fact that it had all these co-op missions. And for the next couple of years, I had a group of friends and we would log on almost every night and play the game. And those were some of my favorite times ever playing any video games. Now, right in the middle of all of that, in 2015, our second son was born, and my life changed kind of dramatically. Turns out that having two kids makes it so you don't have a lot of free time. And so eventually I just stopped playing Destiny. I didn't have time to play with everyone else. But in the back of my mind, I always had this desire to play Destiny on a handheld device. And I tried all sorts of different ways, streaming it to an iPad or a phone, but it just never seemed to be the same. But I will say that the moment I heard that the AOKZOE A1 was going to be shipping over to my house for a quick review, this was the first game I thought about. In particular, I knew the new Ryzen 6800U was going to be a wonderful chip for these kind of games, and based on the pictures I've seen of the device, it looked like it was going to be pretty comfortable for first-person shooters as well. And yes, it turns out that this device, among any others I've ever tested, is like the ultimate Destiny 2 machine. And despite the fact that I'm actually terrible at this game now because I haven't played it in so long, I still had a great time playing this game, to the point where I personally started considering backing the Kickstarter project. And so in this video, I'm going to give you some quick impressions of my experience with this prototype unit, and whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you and your gaming needs. And so, without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so first surprise with this device, I knew the company was sending it to me, but I didn't know from where. And it turns out that ETA Prime himself sent it directly to my house. And as you can imagine, I was a little bit starstruck and kind of fanboyed over that. But then when I opened up the box, I saw he didn't send me any cookies, he didn't even write me a love letter, so I felt a little bit scorned about that. Either way, this is going to be the exact same unit that he was testing. So let's start with some quick impressions. Now first, holding this device, it feels very impressive. That 8-inch screen really feels like it takes up the entirety of the device. And I know everyone's interested in hearing my thoughts about the D-pad, but we'll get to that last. We'll start with the components up top. We have the power button, volume buttons, headphone jack, USB-C port, and then a USB 3.0 port. Also up top, we have the exhaust vent. Now the shoulder and trigger buttons are a little bit unique. The shoulder buttons themselves are pretty clicky. They remind me of an Xbox controller. And luckily, they're easy to press down on no matter where you are on the button. Now these triggers are analog, and I like the way they're molded. They actually fit really nicely with your finger. The material of the shoulder and trigger buttons is very glossy. It actually makes it so that your fingers kind of stick a little bit to it. And it gives you a bit of grippiness as well, which I think is going to be good when you're playing games that rely on these two buttons. Now in terms of just overall weight and balance, this does feel really good. In fact, this feels a lot better than I was expecting. It's not too heavy or lopsided in any way. Okay, now let's check out the back. So here at the front and center, we have the air intake. This also looks to be some LED lights. Unfortunately, those aren't working on the prototype just yet. It also has a kickstand, which is reminiscent of the original Nintendo Switch, but it is quite a bit more sturdy than that one. But the highlight of the back is definitely these rounded grips here. These things are massive, and honestly, I love it. I love the chunkiness here that I can just kind of grab onto the whole thing with my whole hand here. It feels like there are no compromises when it comes to the ergonomics and comfort here. On the bottom, we have a USB-C port as well as an SD card slot. I'm very happy to see that because that means we can use some cheap storage. Let's take a look at the whole face altogether. So on the bottom, we have some front-firing speakers, and then up top, we have a back and start button. On the bottom right, we have a mouse button as well as a turbo button. We'll show more of that here in a minute. And then on the left is a desktop button. This basically will remove all the windows so you can get right to the Windows desktop. Okay, so now let's talk about the controls here. We'll start with the analog stick first. And these feel pretty good. I would say they're a cross between an Xbox-style analog stick and one from the Nintendo Switch. The padding at the top is a little bit rubbery and kind of small, and that's what kind of reminds me of the Nintendo Switch. I would say altogether this is about maybe 80 or 90% the size of an Xbox controller one. And both analog sticks are the same height, same size, they both click down L3 and R3. Yeah, I think they're pretty good. Okay, now let's talk about the face button. I was happy to see just how big and chunky these are as well. In fact, these are much bigger than on most handhelds. I also like the fact that they're flat and glossy. We don't see that enough in handhelds. These buttons are rubber conductive and they have a good amount of travel to them. I got no complaints here. They feel really good and professional. They remind me a bit of a PlayStation button. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the D-pad. Now, first impression here is that it's very glossy, much like the shoulders and triggers. I should note here, the rest of the device is not glossy. It has a bit of a matte feel to it that feels really good. But the plastics on the D-pad is very glossy, and it does make it a little bit grippy too. Now, the design of this D-pad is meant to be an 8-way directional D-pad, much like how it is on the Xbox Series controllers. But it does have a different feel than an Xbox controller. It actually is a rubber conductive connection here. And so in the end, it kind of feels like a mix between an original D-pad, like something from a Nintendo, and then also that 8-way controller feel of an Xbox. And I think the combination of these two elements is just shy of ideal. I think if they want to use an 8-way connector control like this, they should probably use micro switches instead to make it a little bit more precise. Or if they're going to use a rubber conductive pad, then they should use just a regular cross D-pad. Now, of course, I'm just testing this without actually turning it on, so it may be a different experience when we're playing a game, so we'll test that more later. But yeah, overall, I'm actually very pleased with the ergonomics and controls of this device. I love the fact that the analog sticks are more towards the top of the device here. It makes them very comfortable to hold with the shoulders and triggers. The analog sticks don't get in the way of the buttons. It's just overall a really nice design. In terms of ergonomics, when it comes to handheld PCs like this, I think this is second only to the Steam Deck. And so, speaking of other devices, let's do some comparisons now. We'll start with weight. This one weighs 674 grams altogether. But bear in mind that this device will come in two different battery models, and I have the lighter of the two. Now, this model is actually the exact same weight as the Steam Deck itself. And for comparison, that means it's a little bit heavier than the Aya Neo Retro Power from 2021, but also a little bit lighter than the Aya Neo Next. So overall, in regards to its size, it's actually fairly lightweight for what it does. Now let's do some size comparisons. We'll start with a smaller device here. This one has a 3.5-inch screen. And what's ironic about this is when I reviewed the RG353P, I actually said that it was a little bit too big to be pocketable. And so I think it goes without saying that the AOKZOE A1 will not be able to fit in your pocket. Let's do some more realistic comparisons. We'll start with the AYN Odin. This one's about the size of a Nintendo Switch Lite. Here's the most recent Anbernic release, the Win600. And here's a Nintendo Switch OLED edition. Here's that Aya Neo Retro Power, and then also here is the Aya Neo Next. And so we're getting pretty close to the same size here. In fact, the only other one that's bigger than this is going to be the Steam Deck. And everybody knows, the Steam Deck is a large device, and this one is a little bit less wide than that. But I think this is a little bit like apples to oranges. For example, the A1 is much thicker than the Steam Deck itself. But as I mentioned before, I really like the chunky grips that are here in the A1. In fact, I think I prefer these over the Steam Deck. Because it's thick and just hefty feeling, it just feels a little bit less brittle than the Steam Deck itself. And it turns out that even though it's only a little bit less wide than the Steam Deck, that difference is kind of palatable. In particular, you can see the spacing of the face buttons is much further out on the Steam Deck than on the A1. And so even though it's only a little bit smaller than the Steam Deck, when you're actually holding it in the hands, it feels both smaller and chunkier, which is kind of hard to explain. And finally, just for one more comparison, here it is against the Miyoo Mini. And so yeah, there's no mistaking, this AOKZOE is a very large device. And one of the nice things about being so big like this is it allows you to have the space to do other things. For example, the buttons on this are pretty nice and big. They're a little bit less than 9mm altogether. So now let's compare that against some other handhelds. We'll go with the smallest buttons to the largest. And as you can see here, this handheld PC actually has some pretty big buttons compared to some of its competition. The buttons are even bigger than on the Steam Deck, and to me that's a great thing. I love having console-sized buttons. And while this device is just a little bit shy of something like a PS5 or an Xbox Series controller, I'm still really impressed by the size of the buttons here. I hope that future devices tend to have bigger buttons as well. And so yes, in summary, it's a big device, but it doesn't feel as big as you might think it is. And it also has a nice chunkiness to it as well that just forms really well in the hand. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about setup because I do think it's going to be different by the time this device actually releases. But it was a pretty standard setup. I had to download and install the graphics drivers, and then a couple others just to make sure everything was functioning correctly. Now before we get into the gaming, I do want to talk a little bit about the thermal performance. When it was at idle, it ran at about 2 to 3 watts altogether and about 47 degrees Celsius. Now once I turned on Cinebench, you can see that it caps out at about 20 watts of power. And by default, the device will run at about 15 watts, but it will bump up to 20 as needed. And so after a few minutes of running at 100% load at 15 watts, I got to about 69 degrees Celsius. Now on the bottom right is a turbo button, which will actually clock it to 28 watts instead. It's really handy to have this button right here on the device. Now once I set that, it immediately went up to 28 watts, but also the temperature increased as well. All in all, at 28 watts, it averaged about 84 degrees Celsius, so the cooling on this is actually pretty impressive. So personally, I wasn't really concerned about thermal throttling at those temperatures, but it did make me worry a little bit about the battery life. And so for all my testing that I'm actually going to do here today, I'm actually going to leave it at 15 watts. And a lot of that came down to the performance. When I actually toggled between 15 and 28 watts, I found that the performance was negligible given the fact that we were basically doubling the amount of power. This scene from Rise of the Tomb Raider is a great example. I'm actually running this at its native resolution under low settings. And at 15 watts, we're alternating between maybe 35 and 45 frames per second. But when I press that turbo button on the bottom right and switch it over to 28 watts, it actually is about the same frame rate altogether. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this could be happening. First and foremost, this is a brand new chip, and so optimizations probably haven't occurred within the AMD drivers. But also a component of that may be the fact that 15 watts is kind of the sweet spot for this chip. Just a couple weeks ago, the Fox did a video with the GPD WinMax 2, which also has this same chip, and he found the same results. As you can see here with a 15 watt TDP, he's getting about 65-67 frames per second with Batman Arkham Knight. And that's a big jump from 11 watts, but if you bump it all the way up to 28 watts, it only actually goes up about 9 frames per second. And so at least in my initial testing, when in handheld mode, it didn't make sense for me to crank it up to 28 watts because you're getting to a point of diminishing returns. Now, if you're going to play this docked or plugged in, then yeah, just go crazy, crank it up to 28 and see what you can get. But because this is a handheld PC and I'm expecting many people to play it in handheld mode, I kept it to 15 watts so you could see just kind of the average performance. So let me kind of walk you through my setup here. First and foremost, when it comes to me and handheld gaming, I'm not really a numbers guy. I don't spend a lot of time just kind of reading the numbers and getting my enjoyment out of that. Instead, for me, it's all about whether or not a game plays smoothly and whether or not it looks nice. And so for my PC game testing, what I would do is I would set it to the native resolution of 1920 by 1200, and then I would adjust the settings to as high as they went while still playing smoothly. So for example, here with Doom Eternal, we're getting an average of about 45 frames per second, and to me that's just about perfect. The medium settings graphics look great on an 8-inch screen like this, and it has a nice high resolution as well. And of course, if you would prefer a higher frame rate, then you would have to lower the resolution or the settings instead. But for me, this was a great experience here at 45 frames per second. And I had a similar experience with other kind of heavy-hitting games. Resident Evil 3 is a great example here. I'm using that same native resolution, but I bumped it down to low settings instead. And it looked great, and the ergonomics on this also made this feel really good as well. And of course, I had to play the game that I've probably played the most this year, which is Hades, just to kind of get a feel for it, and yeah, it feels great on this device. And really, there's no surprises there. This game should play well on such a nice chip. But one thing that did strike me about this is just how big that 8-inch screen size is compared to the other handhelds I have, which are 7 inches. As you can see in this comparison with the Steam Deck, it feels like the A1 screen is just dwarfing the other one. To me, it's kind of amazing that an 8-inch screen like this makes such a big difference. And to be honest, this is probably one of the most impressive things about this device. I feel like I'm getting more screen and less handheld than the Steam Deck. And of course, you are losing out on those trackpads, but honestly, I don't really use them that much myself. Not only that, I really like the 16:10 aspect ratio they use on these devices. We'll show more of that later when we do some retro game emulation. Either way, I'm a big fan of this screen. Now, a lot of people ask me to play some D-pad prominent games, so things like Celeste or maybe Cuphead. And so 2 thoughts here. Number 1 is the placement of the D-pad. I actually think it's pretty good. I think that it's high enough up on the device itself that it doesn't feel unpleasant or uncomfortable to hold it like this. Now, my second thought here is that I was getting a lot of accidental diagonals when I was using that D-pad. And again, I think a lot of this comes down to that rubber membrane connection instead of micro switches. It just doesn't feel quite as precise. In fact, it got to the point where I preferred using an analog stick with some games that I typically would use a D-pad for. For example, with Cuphead, I actually found myself using the analog stick more than the D-pad. And so I do think that that just unconsciously says a lot of things about the D-pad itself. But another thought that kept coming to me was that this is not a great handheld for 2D platformers anyway. It might work in a pinch if you just want to play a game here and there, but where this device really shines is in that dual analog stick gameplay. And honestly, the only other dedicated handheld that comes close to this is the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck also has those nice analog sticks really high up in the device, and it does feel really natural. And so I just think naturally this is an analog stick-minded device. And so I think that's something to consider if you are considering this device, is what type of games you plan on playing on it. If they are analog stick games, I think you'll have a great time. But if you're looking for more D-pad dominant gaming, then I don't think this is going to be a great fit, and the other ones that you could find are probably going to be a lot cheaper anyway. Anyway, those are my thoughts when it comes to the analog versus D-pad kind of debate surrounding this device. I think that what this device is meant for is analog style gameplay, and it does that really well. Now, I got a few more questions about D-pad gaming when it came to playing fighting games. And much like with a platformer where I was getting accidental diagonals, I was also having a hard time throwing dragon punches and things like that in Street Fighter V. And so if you're looking for a specific handheld for fighting games and you're a D-pad fighting game kind of guy, this also may not be a very good fit. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the games that were a little bit more demanding that I did have to drop the resolution for. And I only really have one point I want to make in this section, and that is the fact that even running this at a 1280 by 800 resolution looks fantastic on this 8-inch screen. For example, when I was playing Hellblade, even at low settings here at 1280 by 800, I was mesmerized. The graphics were incredible on this. And by dropping down that resolution, you are going to be able to play some of those really heavy-hitting games. You could actually play quite a few rounds of Call of Duty Warzone on this thing as well. Now, I only have a couple minutes of footage with this because this game stresses me out so bad, but I did play it for a little bit, and yeah, it ran really well. I would say at a 720p resolution, you can definitely tell that it is at a lower resolution as you're playing. And the frame rate seemed to hover between 50 and 55 frames per second, which I think is pretty good with such a new game on a handheld like this. I used similar settings with Cyberpunk 2077. I was getting an average of maybe 40 frames per second, and the game looked gorgeous even at 800p. Okay, so that's really about it when it came to my PC game testing. I was really impressed by this, and basically everything I threw at it was in some way, shape, or form playable. It really came down to what resolution and graphical fidelity you were willing to live with. So now let's move over to my favorite part of all of these videos, which is retro game emulation. We're not even going to try some of that lower stuff, we're going to jump right into GameCube. And honestly, all I did here is I set it to a Vulkan backend, turned it up to 1080p or 3x resolution, and then just kind of jumped into every game and saw what would play. And it turns out that every GameCube game was playing at 1080p, no problem here. In fact, with some of the lighter games, you could probably bump it up to a 4x resolution to really max out that fidelity. Either way, I would say that you can rest assured that if you do want to play GameCube on this device, it's going to look great. And not only that, because of the 16:10 aspect ratio, the 4:3 content is going to look nice and big on the screen as well. Just look at how massive everything is here, and I'm not even using a widescreen hack. Now when it came to PlayStation 2, it was basically the exact same experience. I turned it to a 3x resolution or 1080p and just had a bunch of fun. To me, this is super impressive considering the fact that none of these emulators have been optimized for the 6800U chipset yet. And so the fact that they are playing at a 1080p resolution out of the box without any sort of special configuration means that 6 months or a year from now, this thing is going to be amazing. The only PS2 game I had to make some adjustments with was God of War 2. I did have to drop this one down to 720p, but after that it was a stable 60 frames per second. So to me, this is an indicator that all the PS2 games are going to run great on this device. So let's kick it up another generation. We'll start with PS3. Now for this, I didn't do anything other than just load up the game. So I didn't adjust any of the settings, and I kept everything at the native 720p resolution of the original PS3. And I will say for PS3, the performance was kind of mixed, but that does make sense because there's a wide range of variety when it comes to accuracy and emulation performance on RPCS3. But in general, I was really impressed with how everything was just out of the gate. So for example, Dead or Alive 3, you have all these things happening in the background, yet the game still plays really well. It's going to have some stutters here and there, but overall it's a smooth experience. And so at least based on the PS3 games that I tested, I would comfortably say that at least half the PS3 catalog is going to be totally playable. But you may have to make some emulation adjustments for some of those other games. Of the games that I tested, the only one that really struggled with performance was Devil May Cry. This one hovered around 20 frames per second when 30 is its actual target. But overall, I was impressed with how PS3 performed, and I think it's just going to get better from here. Alright, let's move on to our next system here. Let's do Wii U. For this one, I kept everything at a native resolution, and that's going to depend on the game. I think Splatoon was a 1080p game originally. Either way, as you can see here, 60 frames per second, no problem with this game. Same thing with Wind Waker HD. This one ran at 30 frames per second and 1080p, but as you can see, it's nice and smooth and a joy to play. But of course, when it comes to Wii U, everyone wants to know about Breath of the Wild, and I do want to show here it runs really well. We're running at a native resolution of 720p, and I did lower the shadows down to a low setting. But altogether, the frame rate would hover between 35 and 45 frames per second, and that's actually really nice and smooth with this game. In fact, anything over 30 is going to be great, and I never really saw it dip below 30, so I think this is going to be a nice smooth gameplay experience. Okay, and so now let's move over to Nintendo Switch. I'm going to start with some of the easier games and kind of work my way up from here. I would say with the user emulator, the performance was pretty good. It didn't blow my socks off, and it wasn't as good as I was expecting it to be with such a new chip. But again, I think this all has to come down to optimizations. And a lot like with the PS3, I would say based on my assessment here, at least 50% of the Switch games are going to play just fine. But of course, there are going to be games that do struggle with emulation. For example, Mario Kart Deluxe did have a stutter every once in a while, and it struggled to stay at 60 frames per second. But as you can see, the gameplay was relatively smooth, and it plays a lot faster on the Wii U if you want to play that version of the game too. Paper Mario, the Origami King, did have some slowdowns in certain cutscenes, but when it came to just kind of moving Mario around, no problems here. And Mario Tennis Aces did have some graphical issues, which is a known thing with Vulkan backend, with this game in particular. But unfortunately, the OpenGL version just showed a black screen, and so unfortunately I would say this game is not playable. Link's Awakening also didn't run at full speed, there was some tangible slowdown here, and same thing with Super Mario Odyssey, this one ran the slowest of all the games I tested. But again, I think this all comes down to optimizations and time. There are chips that are much less powerful than this one that can play this game better. And so to me, what that means is that the user team just needs time with the chip, and potentially some new drivers might update things as well. I also saw some similar struggles with the Xbox emulator. Again, I think this just comes down to optimizations and drivers. But as you can see here, Halo Combat Evolved at a 2x resolution struggled to keep up. Which actually got me thinking, because the Xbox emulator often does better in Linux, so I decided to try that out as well. So I spent a few hours trying to troubleshoot Batocera and to get it to boot on this device. Now, I was successful in getting it to boot, but I did have all sorts of scaling issues, especially within Emulation Station. But luckily, when I started up a game, they actually all booted up fine and they were full screen. Again, here's a great example of how 4x3 content looks fantastic on this screen. It fills up almost that whole display. And so I just did some quick testing here to make sure everything was going to run great, and as you can see, Nintendo 64 was great. Same thing with arcade games. A lot of people are interested in getting Killer Instinct to work on a handheld device, and as you can see here, it's running great. Also, while I was in here, I decided to try out some Street Fighter games just to do some more testing of that D-pad, and yeah, sure enough, this just doesn't work out very well for these particular types of games. But again, if you're looking for that D-pad fighting game experience in the arcade, there are devices that cost about $100 that can play all the way up through CPS3 games no problem. So while the D-pad wasn't a great fit for these games for me in particular, it didn't really bother me that much because it didn't seem like it was a good fit anyway. Okay, let's keep going with emulation here on Batocera. We'll do PSP next. And as you can see here, I just set it to a 4x resolution or 1080p and it ran great. Again, no matter what I threw at it, was playing at full speed. In fact, these games are playing so smoothly that you can probably put it up to a 5x resolution to really max out the graphical fidelity. I also tested out Nintendo 3DS because this one typically will work better in Linux as well, and yeah, as you can see here, 3x resolution with Mario Kart 7, no problems whatsoever. And even though I already tested them, I did try out GameCube and PS2 on Batocera, and these also ran really well at 1080p. And I'm happy to report, when using the original Xbox emulator at a 2x resolution, all the games played at full speed as well. And so I think between Windows and Linux, when it comes to retro game emulation all the way up through Gen 5 and some Gen 6, you're going to have no problems here. Okay, and so wrapping things up here are my impressions of the AOKZOE A1. I had a couple days with this device, and I gotta say that I'm pretty impressed with it. Number one, I really love this screen. The 8 inches is amazing. I never realized how much I wanted one until I had one in my hands. I also love the 16:10 aspect ratio and the fact that the screen takes up so much of this device. The shoulders and triggers are nice and responsive. I actually really like these. And while I do wish the analog sticks were a little bit bigger, I do think they are a great size. The face buttons are probably a highlight for me. I love the fact that they're big and glossy and flat. It's just a really good mix for a handheld. The grips and the chunkiness are also a highlight here. This is one of the most comfortable handhelds I've ever held. But of course, there's also that D-pad. I do think that this probably could be improved upon. I understand what the company was doing by trying to make an 8-way directional D-pad, much like something like on the Xbox. And I do appreciate the fact that it is raised from the device as well. It does feel comfortable to push down on. The problem is, by virtue of using rubber membrane connection, it's just not as precise as I was hoping it would be. Let's take a look at the Xbox Series controller here. This one also has a very similar setup, although the center is a little bit more indented than on the A1. But as you can hear from the clickiness here, this uses a micro switch connection, which makes it very precise. I'm also not a huge fan of this D-pad either, especially when it comes to retro gaming, but all the same, it does feel nice and precise. And so my hope would be that in the final product, the A1 is not going to have a rubber membrane connection, but a micro switch one instead. Or even better, they could take a page from the Xbox Elite series instead. This one had swappable D-pads between a regular cross pattern and then this one here. And it might be a little bit too late in the production cycle to think about something like this, but I think this would have been a more ideal selection. But I gotta be honest, at the end of the day, I surprised myself in finding that I actually didn't really care about the D-pad at all. Because D-pad gaming is just not what this device was meant to do. Instead, I consider this to be a device that's going to be very good for first-person shooters or 3D action games, things like that. Because the way the analog sticks are set up, it's just a very analog stick prominent device, and because of that, this is a really good fit in that regard. And so for me, instead of lamenting the fact that this isn't going to be a very good fit for platforming games as well as fighting games that use a D-pad, what I ended up doing instead is concentrating on the things that it was good at. And in those regards, this thing was excellent. I think the best way to summarize the way I feel about this device is that this Kickstarter's been out for a couple weeks already and I hadn't considered getting one at all. After all, as a consequence of having a YouTube channel where I review handheld devices, I have a couple of these handheld PCs already. But after spending a couple days with this screen and these ergonomics and the power of the 6800U, I'm now seriously considering backing one of these myself. And that idea is just preposterous. I have so many devices and so little time to actually play the games. But all the same, the performance on this as well as the screen and ergonomics were so impressive that it did make me a little bit tempted. Now the other elephant in the room is that this is not the only 6800U handheld device that's coming out in the future. While this is the first one that's available and it's probably going to be the first one that actually ships to people, there are going to be other options out there with this same chipset. So if you are looking for a device that is maybe a little bit smaller or has a different D-pad setup, then you may have some options available to you in the future. But for now, as a standalone device in a vacuum, this thing is really impressive. Anyway, that's about it for this impressions here. This is probably the longest impressions video I've ever done, but I had a lot of fun testing this device and all the things that it could do. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and in the video description, I'll leave a link to the Fox's video where he talks more about that 15 to 28 watt TDP, and I'll also leave a link to their Kickstarter campaign and also a giveaway that they're hosting as well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.